Okay, so with us today, we have the Athletics Italian football correspondent James Horncastle, as well as Jack Pitt-Brooke, who covered Antonio Conte's time at Tottenham. James, Antonio Conte wasn't so pleased with his Napoli play, saying they melted like snow in the sunshine after Sunday's 3-0 defeat against Verona. Just give us a little bit of context to that. It seems super early, though, for him to be pretty angry. The season hasn't even started properly yet.
Absolutely, Ayo. I mean, he'd already kind of put us all on message last week when Napoli needed penalties to eliminate second division Modena from the Coppa Italia. That game had finished 0-0 and was not what a lot of people expect from a Conte season opener, because in the past at Juventus and Inter, they've tended to score 4 goals in their first game, and everyone gets excited and says, this team is going to win something this year. And so when it came to their first game in Serie A away in Verona, there was some anticipation that, okay, we're going to see a team that challenges for the title this year. And in patches in the first half, they played quite well. They had a couple of chances where they could have taken the lead. And then in the second half, as he alludes to in that comment about the players melting like snow in the sunshine, they completely collapsed. They lost 3-0 to a team that over the last 2 years has really kind of circled the drain of relegation in Serie A, has had all kinds of things go against it. Verona, for example, the season before last needed a relegation playout to stay in the league. Napoli incidentally signed a player who kept them up in that relegation playout for 18 million. And then last year, they had this curious situation where kind of Italy's, not fraud squad, but one of the kind of divisions that looks after financial crime, they seized the company that has a majority share in Hellas Verona, which forced the club to sell a load of players in January. And again, people were expecting Verona to go down. They didn't. But no one was expecting Verona to win 3-0 against Napoli on the weekend in the first game of the season. They deserve a lot of credit for doing so. But that is why Conte already is kind of simmering, coming to a boil. And whilst, his comments were strong, he didn't fully explode. But you can see that as we get into the final week of the transfer window, he certainly expects more from his executive team to deliver the players that he feels he needs in order for this team, not even to contend for the title, just to be competitive.
Yeah. Jack, simmering, coming to the boil. I know you've sat in press conferences with Antonio Conte when he was in charge of Tottenham. We've seen some of that, on our screens. What is he really like when questions are thrown at him?
He's not... I know he's got a reputation as being incredibly fiery and emotional, and he is like that sometimes, but I don't want to give people the wrong impression. I'd say in about 80 to 90% of Conte press conferences, he's actually quite measured, or he's very measured. He's actually quite predictable, and maybe that's a function of him not being... I don't think he's very confident in English, which I think is a factor. Like he doesn't kind of tell funny anecdotes or go off on long kind of rambles about what he's very, like, a lot of the time in press conferences he's very measured, and you can kind of predict what he's going to say. It'll be, we've got to work hard in every aspect, the physical aspect, the tactical aspect. He talks about work, he talks about suffering, he talks about the high standards he expects from his players, and so 9 times out of 10 you can predict in advance what he's going to say. But there's always that kind of 10% where he just goes off on one, and I've not really seen a manager who kind of loses control of his emotions like Conte does at certain moments. Sometimes he'll be having a go because it's widely accepted that he is a different person during a transfer window, for example. If particularly if he wants to put pressure on his employers to spend some money, and particularly at Tottenham, whenever there was a transfer window come around, he would be a lot more political in press conferences, and then sometimes he's just incredibly upset. Like the two that stand out, I mean, everybody will always remember the one at Southampton, which was his last act as Tottenham manager and basically ended his time at Tottenham, where he just killed his players over the course of, I think, an 8 or 9 minute press conference. And then there was another one actually in Burnley in his first season at Tottenham, so this would have been about February 2022, where he basically sounded like he was on the brink of quitting, because I think they'd lost a poor game 1-0 at Burnley, and he looked exasperated. And so he's always got that. He's not like that all the time, but he always has that in his locker.
Yeah, and I think nobody wears disappointment more on their face and in their tone than Conte. I think, to go back to what Jack was saying about he has this reputation for fieriness. Yes, there are a couple of exceptional moments in the past where he has been very kind of vituperative, in talking to the media. But for the most part, this is someone who feels losses, I think, more than most coaches. I think most coaches accept that you're going to win some, you're going to lose some. I think with Conte, losing is just so anathema to who he is as a person. I mean, a lot was made a few years ago about the fact that his daughter is called Vittoria, which Victoria does mean victory, essentially. It is everything to him, and how every loss has this kind of depleting effect on his life force, that he feels like he is being diminished with every defeat, and it brings him closer, not to death, but, he's someone who really believes in this football is life and death kind of mentality. And so he takes it personally when a team loses or doesn't perform. And again, to go to Jack's point about the predictability of some of his comments, I mean, I think his employers know what they're getting. They absolutely know that there are going to be press conferences and post-match interviews like this, that he is going to be demanding in a transfer window. Not demanding in the way that I think he has a perception for being demanding, which is, if you hire Conte, he's going to be expensive. He's going to he's going to push you to the limits of what you can spend. He doesn't see it that way. He's not going to tell you that you have to go and sign someone for 100 million for the sake of signing someone for 100 million. But if he says this team needs another centre-back, another wing-back, another striker, he expects you to go out and find those players. I think the more worrying thing that he said quite quickly at the weekend was it wasn't really about the transfer window anymore. It was it doesn't matter how many players the club signs in the next week. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's the mentality that I didn't like today, and that isn't something that you can coach over a very short period of time. so again, it's like, well, okay, if you can't coach this in a short period of time, then kind of what are you doing there? And there are all these things with Conte where he immediately goes to the very sensitive points that I think a lot of coaches themselves acknowledge privately about their team, but he's sort of still willing to either allude to them in public or be very direct about them in public.
Yeah, James, I want to talk to you about this connection with Aurelio De Laurentiis in just a second, because that one, I'm trying to ready to unpack that one, because that's a fiery one to say the least. But Jack, in terms of this style of managing and this style of coaching, I guess Conte is one of the older school managers, maybe a bit like an Alex Ferguson. I think De Laurentiis even said something about loving what Alex Ferguson's done in Manchester, and actually Antonio Conte fits that kind of style. But does it seem a little out of touch with, I guess the Mikel Artetas of this world, or potentially even the Pep Guardiolas of this world? I don't think I've seen Pep Guardiola ever crucify players like that publicly. Yeah,
I think what he really relies on when he comes into a club more than anything else is friction. Like he wants to rub people up the wrong way, and he wants to he wants to tell them that they haven't been good enough, they're out of shape, they need to, when he came into Spurs, he said the players were out of shape, and he kind of ripped up the diet and stopped them from eating nachos and sandwiches and all the rest of it, and got them eating fruit and vegetable, and all that kind of stuff. I think he likes that kind of friction. I think he thinks that friction is how you get through to people. And I generally think that in modern football, it's less common to have a manager who has that kind of approach. Like managers, it's much, generally speaking, when managers come into a club now, it's much more about generating that buy-in through positivity. And I know that Conte might well say that, he needs that buy-in too. He does want to bring the players with him, but there's also a lot of it always starts with this phase of, look how awful everything is here. Haven't I got a huge job to do to turn this team around? And he did start that way at Spurs. He came in and I think they played NS Mura in the Europa Conference League, and he came in and said, the level here is very low. And it seems to me like what he's saying about Napoli this week is more or less in tune with that. He needs that friction is basically his starting point.
Yeah. Then let's go to this connection then with another volatile character, James. De Laurentiis, Antonio Conte. I feel like in a very old-fashioned Italian way, there's a level of respect here that they both have for each other, right? How does that work in terms of Conte demanding things and De Laurentiis often not willing to put his hand in his pocket that often?
Yeah, I mean, De Laurentiis, to his credit, he took over Napoli when they were on the brink of extinction. Yeah, they were going out of business. He picked them up for little or nothing, and he's run them on a very prudent basis ever since. Perhaps with the exception of in COVID, when they signed Victor Osimhen for a club record 70 million euro. So, given De Laurentiis's policy of only kind of spending what you make, you do look at Napoli's situation and you see that they are not in the Champions League. They're not in Europe at all this year. And so unless they can raise funds through the transfer market, through selling players, then it's a challenge to find the kind of money, as I said, not to go out and spend 100 million on a player, but to sign lots of different players to completely retool the team for Conte's way of playing, which I was quite curious about going into this season because he's had more or less a year out since he left Tottenham. And you do wonder, okay, is this when we're going to see an Antonio Conte update? Are we going to see him play with a different style, a different system, or is he just who he is right now and he's not going to change? And you alluded to De Laurentiis' volatile character. Fair play to him. He is not afraid to have those kind of friction, scintillating discussions that kind of Jack alluded to. This is someone who's hired Rino Gattuso. It's someone who's hired Luciano Spalletti, who is a prickly character as well. And so, I think people have looked at how this can possibly work between these two people. But I would say that, because it's worked under Gattuso, who won a cup, it's worked under Spalletti, it doesn't mean it can't work under Antonio Conte as well. I think, with De Laurentiis, the issue has been that people leave Napoli because they find it difficult to work with him. Spalletti, for example, he won the league. No one had won the league with Napoli since 1990. And, he wanted to walk away on that basis and was initially told, no, you can't walk away. I'm unilaterally extending your contract, which kind of really annoyed him. And they ultimately came to an agreement where Spalletti was able to go on sabbatical, but Spalletti wanted out. Carlo Ancelotti, who is this avuncular character who gets on with everybody, was essentially, fired at Napoli, where there was this mutiny about kind of the club going over his head and saying, yeah, they need to be in a punitive training camp because they're not performing, which is just not Carlo Ancelotti's way of working. And so the durability, I suppose, of a coach's lifetime at Napoli is always in question. So we'll have to see. I mean, I think it's on the one hand, it's a very ambitious appointment because I think Antonio Conte, when he left Spurs, he probably, because of what he's won in his career, because of his status in the game, still believed he could get a job with, let's say, a Manchester United, a Real Madrid, a Bayern Munich, or one of the other vacancies that was there in Italy this summer, which is, AC Milan. And instead, De Laurentiis has got him. But I think Conte's had to accept, in some respects, going to Napoli. He's had to accept a pay cut in order to be back in work at a club that is more or less at the level that he thinks he's at. But I think it is a little bit of a climb down for Conte. There has had to be some humility, I think, in accepting, okay, you mentioned old school managers. When De Laurentiis was making that comparison with Sir Alex Ferguson, it was specifically to the point about a manager who has to have a say on recruitment and it almost be the final word on recruitment. Whereas most modern football clubs, owned by American hedge funds, private equity, who are used to, running the data before they invest in stock, they want to have the last say and the primary say when it comes to where their money is being spent. And ultimately, I think that's why Conte didn't get some of the other jobs that were available this summer, and it's why he's landed at Napoli.
And I think that a lot of those big clubs, like, I'm sure that Conte feels like he ought to be at a Manchester United or a Real Madrid or someone of that, genuinely the biggest clubs in Europe. But it seems to me like clubs of that size don't particularly they don't think the price is worth the prize with Conte. They don't think the increased chance of winning a league title over a kind of maximum 3-year view is just not worth the friction and the public embarrassment of having your laundry aired in public, basically. Those rows about recruitment and the criticism of the players and the sense of kind of antagonism that Conte brings around. I think a lot of those if Manchester United or Real Madrid or Barcelona or Bayern Munich, if they thought that it was worth it on balance, they would have appointed him by now, and they never have.
I think the interesting thing actually is Napoli are, I wouldn't say they're the Spurs of Italy, but the Spurs obviously won the league under Bill Nicholson in the 60s. And then what have they done since? Napoli won the league twice in the 80s. And there was this thing, what have they done since? De Laurentiis, as an owner, has this reputation for being, very prudent and being a really tough negotiator. Like Daniel Levy. And so
that was my thought. Is there any comparison here? Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
Well, so he's in a club that is, in some respects, similarly run to Tottenham, without the kind of infrastructure that Tottenham can call upon to, I suppose, firepower some of the spending that they now can do thanks to the stadium, because Napoli just don't have a stadium. But in terms of like the culture and I suppose the way of working that there is at that club, there are probably more parallels than you might think. If you look on the pitch, the parallels really are there with some of the other success stories in Conte's coaching career. For example, at Juventus, where he first had his breakout, if you like, that was when they'd finished back-to-back 7th place in Serie A. And all of a sudden, he takes them on. They're out of Europe. he can focus on the league every week, only on the one game, and they went undefeated, and they started this what really was the 9-year winning streak, of which he was a part for 3 years. At Chelsea, he came after the Mourinho season, as he liked to call it. Again, when they were out of Europe, he could focus on the league, and yeah, he won Chelsea's last league title,
and he remains in that season. Incredible. I mean, it's kind of been forgotten by history a little bit, the 16-17 season, but that Conte remains the last person to win the Premier League not called Pep Guardiola or Jurgen Klopp. Which and I know it's 7 years ago now, but such has been the dominance of City and Liverpool in that time frame. I think people forget a bit about the fact that Conte was the last person to do it with a 93-point season, with the team coming off an incredibly difficult spell at the sort of back end of Mourinho, and he transformed them in an instant and made them winners. And I kind of feel like people do kind of forget that a bit when they think about Conte, because of what happened the following season, where again they had rows about transfers and they didn't do anything in Europe, and it was a kind of game of chicken about whether or not he'd be sacked and so on and so forth. But it was an incredible piece of management, that.
Yeah, and I mean, to add more context, I suppose, to that was Mourinho's first year at Manchester United, when they signed Pogba and Mkhitaryan, a load of other players, and everyone expected the challenge to come from Mourinho. Pep was at City, and Klopp was at Liverpool. I mean, that is incredible competition to come through in your first year in a foreign country in the Premier League, which bills itself as the most competitive league in the world, and win the league, regardless of what I think is the other parallel with Napoli, is he inherited a team that was 1 year removed from winning the league, under Jose, and that's the same at Napoli with what he inherited this time around. So, yeah, that's why I've continued to be quite bullish about Conte, for example, being able to win another league title with a third different team in Italy, because but for the centre-back Kim Min-jae, who left Napoli for Bayern Munich last year when Bayern paid the buyout clause in his contract, but for Peter Zielinski, the midfield player, and one of their interchangeable winger, Irving Lozano, who went back to Holland, the team is the same. The problem is he had no problem regenerating Chelsea. The problem is that this group of players that he has at Napoli, when a team hasn't won the league since 1990 and everyone says it's impossible, and then you do it, where else is there to go for this group of players? They will be immortal in Napoli. And I think it's very hard to find motivation and to go again, particularly when a lot of those players think now's the time to move on, because it's never going to be as good as it was when we won the league. And that's the case with Victor Osimhen. Osimhen, who has had to train on his own so far this pre-season because he said he wants to leave. And so Conte says that's completely out of his control. He's a spectator in all of this. It's between Osimhen and the club. And at the moment, he's not available to him. But obviously, Conte would like the money that would come from a transfer of Victor Osimhen to then spend on the team. You've got Kvaratskhelia, who was probably the best newcomer to Serie A in terms of how decisive he was straight away since Kaká at Milan. And Kvaratskelia's agent and his father during the Euros was saying, we want to go, we want to leave. And you've got the captain, Giovanni Di Lorenzo, who I think outside of Italy, a lot of people probably don't know much about, but this is a guy who has come up from the very bottom of Italian football, where teams have gone bust on him. He's been out of contract, and all of a sudden he becomes the first player to captain Napoli to a league title since Diego Maradona. And, his agent has been agitating for a move. He had an absolutely horrendous season last year and a horrendous European Championship. If anyone remembers Nico Williams asphalting him in the Italy-Spain game. And so Conte comes in and he inherits what on paper looks still to be a very competitive team. And yet from a motivational standpoint, it's one of those things where you think, do they actually just need to rip this up and start again? And can they do that? They can't. They're a week from the transfer window closing and the season's already started. So again, Conte's hunger and desire to be back smelling the grass and be back training on a day-to-day basis has led him to make a decision to come back into club football, a little bit like at Tottenham, where you think you can almost question the judgment, where you're like, are you sure you should be rushing into this? Like at Spurs, he turned them down, first of all, and they had to go with Nuno Espirito Santo. And in this one, you think, actually, would he not have been better served waiting it out on the sidelines a little bit longer? Or does he really feel that he has to be working? Because, as I said, on paper, this team looks like it still can be very competitive and can not only improve on last year, but should be able to compete for the title. And maybe the reality is different.
Yeah, okay. I was thinking, Jack, we've gone round the houses. I sort of felt we started with this sort of volatile character and, Conte can be quite difficult to work with, but actually now we're at the point where we're saying, do you know what? Maybe he needs to be respected for a lot of the work that he's done. You talked about what he did at Chelsea, obviously. This is a guy who's won Serie A 4 times, Premier League winner. Can we say Conte's actually an elite manager? Can we actually say he's earned the right to have the gravitas to be an elite manager in the modern game of football?
Yeah, in my mind, he's one of the best managers of his generation. I think what he's done, he, as James said, he started this incredible winning era at Juventus from nowhere. I mean, it feels inevitable now, but it certainly wasn't inevitable at the time. Then he went and won at Chelsea in incredible competition. Actually, we should also say, did pretty well with Italy. It was only one penalty shootout away. I mean, if it wasn't for that penalty shootout that they lost in France, they could easily have won that Euros. They were better team, much better team than Portugal,
with terrible players.
And that won under incredibly difficult conditions at Chelsea, I think, or won with a lot of competition, I should say, at Chelsea, and then went to Inter and won there. So I think his ability to win league titles and to improve teams, he's got a reputation as being a checkbook manager. I don't really think he is. I think he's actually very good at improving not especially good players. So I think he is an incredible coach. And his track record absolutely speaks for itself. But I think that there's always another side with Conte, which is how long he stays at clubs, how the difficulties that he causes you while he is at the club, both particularly for the board. And I actually think that Tottenham was kind of the perfect microcosm of Conte's career. I mean, they didn't win a trophy, that's the one difference, but we should not forget how much Conte improved Tottenham, how good they were for basically the second half of the 21-22 season, where he'd only just showed up, and within a few months they were flying. Like, they were so good. They surged from nowhere up to finish fourth in the Premier League table. They were, by the end of the season, they were keeping clean sheets almost every game. They were scoring tons of goals, and they had Kane and Son, who were all-time great players, but they also had Højbjerg, Skip, Emerson Royale, Eric Dyer, Ben Davis. This was not a team with the number of superstars that he had at Chelsea, for example. But I think the big question that people will always ask is, why couldn't he sustain it? Why did Tottenham fall away so quickly at the start of the 22-23 season, which ended with his sacking? And of course, there's Conte's own personal circumstances, the loss of Ventrone and other close friends of his. Conte was also very ill for a lot of that season, which I think was certainly a problem. But I think there was also a sense that he wasn't happy with the transfer dealings. He never looked he kind of struggled to maintain. He struggled to maintain the confidence of the players. The players quickly got bored, and so I think within that brief spell he had at Spurs, you see both the upside and the downside. But I think no accounting of Conte's career you cannot exclude the upside from any evaluation that you make, because the upside is still huge.
Yeah, I think he is undoubtedly an elite coach. I think in Italy, still to this day, he's regarded as the best coach of his generation, even though Spalletti has come in and done the impossible in winning the league with Napoli, even though there have been all of these kind of bright and innovative young coaches who've come to the fore, like De Zerbi, for example. But people always say in Italy, what's De Zerbi ever won? And I think the only doubt with Conte, and perhaps this is maybe why you asked the question, Ayo, is because of his record in Europe. That is the one lingering thing that I think he would like to change, which is, he has this reputation for, not going beyond the quarterfinals of the Champions League. I think the counterpoint to that has always been, well, he's taken over teams that are often not in the Champions League. So you think of all the years where, for first year at Juventus, they're not in the Champions League, so you can't really judge him there. First year at Napoli, now they're not in the Champions League. First year at Chelsea, they're not in the Champions League. So for an elite coach, he's spent a lot of time outside of the Champions League. The thing that surprises me is that in his interviews prior to taking the Napoli job, he seemed to be very self-aware about, this is where I now need to prove myself. I now need to take over a club that can compete and give me the opportunity to prove people wrong and show that I can do it on that stage in the Champions League. And instead, he's landed at another club that is not going to be in that competition. And so I think for that reason, he will continue to have people detracting from what he's done, without forgetting that, as Pep Guardiola says, winning the league is so tough. Because it's over 38 games, and yet Conte is able to sustain these things over 38 games, whereas in the Champions League or a cup competition, often it comes down to 2 games where a refereeing mistake can amplify something, or where a mischance is weighted differently than a mischance in a league game. You have fewer moments where you can correct things, but I think he's undoubtedly one of the most important coaches in his generation. I mean, if he wins 4 league titles with 4 different clubs, I mean, what are we talking about here?
Yeah. James, very quickly, a lot of Napoli fans would love to know, and I'm sure a lot of Premier League fans would want to know as well, what on earth is going on with Victor Osimhen at Napoli? Is he good to go on to another club anytime soon?
He's good to go in that, the club acknowledge his wish to leave. He did sign a new deal before going to the African Cup of Nations over the winter, and that new deal included a buyout clause, which is very, very high. We're talking between 120 and 130 million euro. And that was punchy at that time, because, if we go back a few years when PSG signed Neymar and Mbappe, perhaps it was foreseeable that strikers would begin to go quite regularly for figures in between 120 and 130 million. But that just hasn't really come to pass. And on the back of the season that Osimhen had last year, where he was often injured, he was at AFCON, he had some off-the-field issues with his club, for example, posting racist TikTok videos that mocked him. They had 3 different coaches as well. But I think all of those things have created kind of Victor Osimhen's value. And, Napoli are very, as we mentioned, De Laurentiis runs a very tight ship where he's like, my valuation for this player is X, and you have to pay it. Otherwise, I'm not going to sell. And I think Premier League fans, particularly Chelsea fans, will remember that there was a long time where every summer they were linked with Kalidou Koulibaly, who did end up at the club when he'd gone into his 30s. I think they still paid 50 million for him. But De Laurentiis was very much like, no, this player, if he is going to go, it's for a world record fee for a centre-back, and I will stand by that. And I think that's where the difficulty is at this moment in time. And I don't think there are that many teams that are looking for a striker, or teams of the caliber that, for example, Victor Osimhen sees as a step up from Napoli, which would be one of the Premier League elite, and maybe Paris Saint-Germain, and so yeah, let's see what happens. But I think it's actually quite difficult to foresee him leaving, considering his own expectations of what his next move looks like, and Napoli's expectations of what a club should be paying for Victor Osimhen.
Okay, and do you think Romelu Lukaku uniting with Conte, a striker that's been very prolific under Conte, will solve Napoli's problems, though? That's the bigger question.
Well, it's how often can you repeat this trick? And again, I think tying yourself to a player like Lukaku. I mean, Lukaku has this reputation of being this prodigious talent who, for most people, I don't think has fulfilled his potential. Even though, for example, at Inter for 2 years, he was extraordinary and helped them win the league for the first time since 2010 under Conte. But yeah, I think for Conte, do you really want to be? We've had this discussion about whether Conte is elite or not. I mean, that's a conversation that's been had about Romelu Lukaku in his own field. I think, Napoli have been trying to do this deal before they sell Osimhen, but I think they still have to sell Osimhen in order to do this deal, because I don't think there's any way that you can have Osimhen's wages on their balance sheet at the same time as you have Lukaku's wages and Conte's wages in a year when they're not in the Champions League. But I would still be quite confident that Napoli have a good season. Just because, Jack and I have spoken in glowing terms about Conte. And if you look at the guys who've gone out of Serie A in the last few months, Max Allegri, serial winner, is no longer employed. Stefano Pioli, who won the league with Milan, no longer employed. Mourinho has left, someone who knows what it takes to win things in Italy. I think the only guy who's left who's won the league, apart from Conte, is the current incumbent, which is Simone Inzaghi with Inter, and that was his first league title. So in terms of that know-how, the only guys who has got it is Conte. And I think still Lukaku is a player who can make the difference in Serie A in a way that he perhaps can't to the same effect in the Premier League. But we need to see. I think as we speak, there are talks going on between Chelsea and Napoli about Lukaku. So let's see what comes of that and what comes of the remaining days of this transfer window.
I remember a Tottenham press conference in 2022 where Conte was talking about how important Harry Kane was to him. And he told a story about a friend of his called Pantaleo Corvino, who was the Fiorentina director of football. And he said that Corvino had given him this phrase which he relied on for understanding football. And Conte said, "You can make a mistake about your wife, but not with your goalkeeper or your striker." And what he was trying to get across is you can't be a good team if you don't have a good keeper or a good number 9. Yeah. And that's how important Kane was. And I just wonder whether if they do manage to get Lukaku over the line, he's obviously a player Conte's worked with before, whether he is able to be that kind of rock that Conte builds his Napoli team on. Mm-hmm. There's a huge responsibility for him.
Yeah, for sure. Brilliant stuff. Gents, thank you so much for your time. Let's see how the season unfolds for Antonio Conte. And do not forget, you can get in touch with us by emailing tafc@theathletic.com. Adam Leventhal will be with you tomorrow for the preview, looking ahead to Arsenal's visit to Aston Villa this weekend in the Premier League. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.